The city was alive, as it always was, with its endless symphony of honking horns, distant sirens, and the hum of people rushing to their next destination. The skyline was a jagged silhouette against the fading orange of the evening sun, and the streets below were a maze of asphalt and neon. Among the chaos, a man sat in the driver's seat of an old, slightly battered sedan. His name was Diesel, though no one called him that anymore. To the world, he was just another face in the crowd, another driver navigating the urban jungle. But Diesel's story was far from ordinary. Diesel wasn't always a man behind the wheel. Once, he had been someone else entirely, a man with dreams, ambitions, and a future that seemed as bright as the city lights. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Now he drove for a ride-sharing app, ferrying strangers from one corner of the city to another, his past buried beneath layers of regret and resilience. It was a Thursday evening, the kind of night where the city felt both endless and suffocating. Diesel had been driving for hours, his back aching from the constant stop-and-go traffic. His phone buzzed with a new request, a pickup at a high-end hotel downtown. He glanced at the name, Evelyn Carter. The destination was an upscale residential area, the kind of place where people lived behind gated walls and tinted windows. When he pulled up to the hotel, a woman in her late 30s stepped out. She was impeccably dressed, her tailored coat and designer heels a stark contrast to Diesel's worn jeans and faded jacket. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, and her eyes carried a sharpness that suggested she was used to getting what she wanted. She slid into the back seat without a word, her perfume filling the car with a scent that was both expensive and intimidating. "Evening," Diesel said, his voice rough from hours of silence. "Heading to Willow Creek?" "Yes," she replied curtly, already typing on her phone. Her tone made it clear she wasn't interested in small talk. Diesel nodded and pulled away from the curb. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the occasional ping of her phone. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, noting the way she carried herself, like someone who had never known a day of hardship. It was a stark contrast to his own life, a life that had been shaped by loss and survival. About halfway through the ride, Evelyn's phone buzzed again, and this time, she let out an exasperated sigh. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. Diesel raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He had learned long ago that some passengers just needed to vent, and it was best to let them do it without interference. "Do you ever feel like the world is just against you?" she asked suddenly, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. The question caught him off guard. It wasn't the kind of thing he expected from someone like her. "Sometimes," he replied cautiously. "But I figure it's all about how you handle it." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Easy to say when you're not the one dealing with boardroom politics and backstabbing colleagues." Diesel shrugged. "Maybe. But everyone's got their battles, right? Doesn't matter if it's in a boardroom or on the streets." Evelyn studied him for a moment, as if seeing him for the first time. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "What were you expecting?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I don't know. Someone less thoughtful, I guess." Diesel chuckled. "Yeah, well, appearances can be deceiving." As they neared her destination, Evelyn's phone buzzed again, and this time, her expression changed. She stared at the screen, her face pale. "No," she whispered. "This can't be happening." Diesel glanced back at her. "Everything okay?" She didn't answer at first, her hands trembling as she held the phone. Finally, she looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "I need to get to the airport." "Now, the airport? But your destination." "Forget that," she snapped, her voice rising. "I need to get to the airport as fast as possible. Please." Diesel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, hang on." He made a sharp U-turn, the tires squealing against the pavement. The car accelerated, weaving through traffic with a precision born of years of experience. Evelyn clutched her phone, her knuckles white, as she muttered to herself. "What's going on?" Diesel asked, his voice calm but firm. "It's my company," she said, her voice shaking. "There's been a takeover. Someone's trying to push me out, and if I don't get to the airport in time, I'll lose everything." Diesel's grip tightened on the wheel. He knew what it was like to lose everything. "We'll get there," he said simply. As they sped toward the airport, Diesel noticed a black SUV tailing them. At first he thought it was a coincidence, but when the SUV matched his every move, he knew better. "We've got company," he said, his eyes flicking to the rear-view mirror. Evelyn turned to look, her face paling even further. "That's them," she whispered. "They're trying to stop me." Diesel's mind raced. He had no idea who they were, but he wasn't about to let them win. "Hold on," he said, pressing the accelerator to the floor. The car shot forward, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. Diesel weaved through traffic, his hands steady on the wheel. The SUV stayed close, its headlights glaring in the mirror. For a moment, it seemed like they might lose them, but then the SUV surged forward, pulling up alongside them. "Duck!" Diesel shouted, swerving to avoid the SUV's attempt to force them off the road. Evelyn screamed, clutching the door handle as the car skidded sideways. Diesel fought to regain control, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been in tight spots before, but this was different. This wasn't just about him anymore. Somehow, they made it to the airport. Diesel screeched to a halt outside the terminal, the tires smoking from the high-speed chase. Evelyn didn't waste a second. She threw open the door and bolted for the entrance, her heels clicking against the pavement. "Wait," Diesel called after her, but she was already gone. He sat there for a moment, catching his breath. The black SUV was nowhere to be seen, but he knew they wouldn't give up that easily. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was late, and he still had bills to pay. But something about Evelyn's desperation had struck a chord in him. As he pulled away from the curb, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "Thank you. You saved more than you know." Diesel stared at the screen, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just a man behind the wheel after all. The days that followed Evelyn's frantic airport drop-off were uneventful, at least on the surface. Diesel went back to his routine, driving, picking up passengers, and trying to make ends meet. But something had shifted. That night, with its high-speed chase and the weight of Evelyn's desperation, had stirred something in him. It was a reminder that life wasn't just about surviving. It was about moments that mattered, moments that could change everything. He found himself thinking about her often. Who was she really? What kind of life did she lead that involved corporate takeovers and black SUVs chasing her through the city? And why had she trusted him, a stranger, to help her in her moment of crisis? The questions gnawed at him, but there were no answers. Evelyn had vanished as quickly as she had appeared, leaving behind only that cryptic message on his phone. One evening, as Diesel was about to call it a night, his phone buzzed. It wasn't a ride request this time. It was a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Diesel. The voice on the other end was familiar, though it carried a tone of urgency he hadn't heard before. "Yeah, this is Diesel. Who's this?" "It's Evelyn. Evelyn Carter. We need to talk." Diesel's grip tightened on the phone. "What's going on?" "Not over the phone." "Can you meet me? I'll send you the address." He glanced at the clock. It was late, and he was exhausted, but curiosity got the better of him. "All right, send it." The address she sent was for a small, nondescript cafe on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place that didn't attract much attention, which Diesel assumed was the point. When he arrived, Evelyn was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked different, less polished, more human. Her hair was down, and she wore a simple sweater instead of her usual designer attire. "Thanks for coming," she said as he slid into the booth across from her. "You didn't really give me much of a choice," he replied, though there was no malice in his tone. "What's this about?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "I owe you an explanation, and I need your help." Diesel raised an eyebrow. "My help? Lady, I'm just a driver. I don't know what kind of mess you're in, but I'm not exactly equipped to handle corporate espionage or whatever this is." "It's not just corporate espionage," she said, her voice low. "It's bigger than that. And you've already proven you can handle yourself in a tight spot." He leaned back, studying her. "Start from the beginning. What's really going on?" Evelyn hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell him. Finally, she began. "My company, Carter Industries, is one of the largest tech firms in the country. We specialize in artificial intelligence and data security. A few months ago, we developed a prototype for a revolutionary AI system, one that could change the way we think about privacy, security, and even human interaction. But it's also incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands." Diesel frowned. "Dangerous? How?" "Imagine an AI that can access any system, anywhere, at any time. It could shut down power grids, manipulate financial markets, even influence elections. The potential for abuse is terrifying. And someone wants it," Diesel guessed. Evelyn nodded. "A rival company? Or maybe more than one. They've been trying to steal the technology for months. That night you drove me to the airport, I was on my way to meet with a government official who could help secure the prototype. But the people chasing us, they're not just corporate rivals. They're connected to something bigger, something darker." Diesel's mind raced. This was way out of his league. "Why are you telling me all this?" "I'm just a guy with a car." "Because you're the only person I trust right now," she said simply. "Everyone else, my colleagues, my so-called friends, they could be compromised. But you have no stake in this. And you've already proven you're willing to help, even when it puts you in danger." He shook his head. "I didn't sign up for this." "I know," she said softly. "But sometimes life doesn't give us a choice. You helped me once. I'm asking you to help me again." Diesel stared at her, torn between the urge to walk away and the part of him that couldn't ignore someone in need. He had spent years trying to forget the person he used to be, a man who believed in fighting for what was right. But that man wasn't entirely gone. He was still there, buried beneath the layers of regret and resignation. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. Evelyn's shoulders relaxed, as if she had been holding her breath. "There's a meeting tomorrow night. A private auction where the prototype is going to be sold to the highest bidder. I need to get in, but I can't do it alone. I need someone who can blend in, someone who won't raise suspicion." "And you think that's me?" "You're resourceful," she said. "And you know how to handle yourself. That's more than I can say for most people." Diesel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This is insane, you know that." "Probably," she admitted. "But it's also important. If this technology falls into the wrong hands, it could change the world, and not for the better." He was silent for a long moment, weighing the risks. Finally, he nodded. "All right. I'm in. But if this goes south, I'm not sticking around to play hero." Evelyn smiled, a genuine smile that softened her sharp features. "Thank you, Diesel. You won't regret this." Over the next few hours, Evelyn filled him in on the details. The auction was being held at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place that was off the grid and heavily guarded. They would need to get in, retrieve the prototype, and get out without being detected. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. "There's one more thing," Evelyn said as they finalized the plan. "If something happens to me, if I don't make it out, you need to destroy the prototype. No matter what." Diesel frowned. "You're talking like this is a suicide mission." "It might be," she said quietly. "But it's a risk I'm willing to take." He didn't like the sound of that, but he didn't argue. There was a determination in her eyes that told him nothing he said would change her mind. As they left the cafe, Diesel couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into something much bigger than himself. This wasn't just about Evelyn or her company. It was about the kind of world they wanted to live in, a world where power wasn't abused, where people still had a chance to fight for what was right. He didn't know if they would succeed. He didn't even know if they would survive. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. And that, he realized, was worth the risk. The night of the auction was cold and unforgiving, the kind of night where the wind cut through layers of clothing, and the moon hung low, casting long shadows over the city. Diesel and Evelyn stood in the darkness outside the abandoned warehouse, their breath visible in the frosty air. The building loomed ahead, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. It looked like a place forgotten by time, but Diesel knew better. Inside, some of the most powerful and dangerous people in the world were gathered, ready to bid on a technology that could change the course of history. Evelyn adjusted the earpiece she was wearing, her hands steady despite the tension in the air. "Remember the plan," she said, her voice low. "We get in, find the prototype, and get out. No detours, no heroics." Diesel nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a knot of unease in his stomach. The plan was simple, but he knew better than anyone that simple plans had a way of going sideways. "And if things go south, then we improvise," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But no matter what happens, the prototype can't fall into the wrong hands." He didn't argue. There was no point. They were in too deep to turn back now. Getting inside was easier than Diesel expected. The guards were focused on the high-profile guests arriving in sleek black cars, not on two figures slipping through a side entrance. Evelyn had done her homework, and she led him through a maze of corridors with the confidence of someone who had memorized every detail. The auction was already underway when they reached the main room. It was a cavernous space, lit by flickering industrial lights that cast eerie shadows on the walls. A crowd of well-dressed men and women stood in clusters, their faces obscured by masks. At the front of the room, a man in a tailored suit was holding up a small device, the prototype. "That's it," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of conversation. "We need to get closer." They moved through the crowd, careful not to draw attention. Diesel kept his head down, his eyes scanning the room for exits and potential threats. The tension was palpable, and he could feel the weight of the stakes pressing down on him. They were almost to the front when it happened. A voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Stop right there." Diesel froze, his heart pounding. He turned to see a man stepping out of the shadows, a gun in his hand. It was someone Evelyn clearly recognized, because her face went pale. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "I should have known you'd be here." The man Marcus smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "You always were too clever for your own good, Evelyn. But this ends now." Diesel's mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan. He glanced at Evelyn, but she was already stepping forward, her hands raised. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "This technology, it's too dangerous. You know that." Marcus laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Dangerous or powerful? There's a difference, Evelyn. And I intend to use it." Diesel knew they were out of options. Marcus had the upper hand, and there was no way they could fight their way out. But as he looked at Evelyn, he saw something in her eyes, a determination, a refusal to give up. It sparked something in him, a resolve he hadn't felt in years. "Evelyn," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I say go, run." She glanced at him, confusion and fear in her eyes. "What are you?" He didn't let her finish. In one swift motion, he grabbed a metal pipe from a nearby stack of debris and hurled it at Marcus. The distraction was enough. Marcus ducked, and Diesel lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. "Go," he shouted, struggling to keep Marcus pinned. Evelyn hesitated for a split second, then turned and ran toward the prototype. The room erupted into chaos as the other guests realized what was happening. Diesel fought to keep Marcus down, but the man was stronger than he looked. With a grunt of effort, Marcus shoved him off and scrambled to his feet, his gun raised. Diesel didn't think. He just acted. He threw himself at Marcus again, this time knocking the gun from his hand. They grappled, each fighting for control, but Diesel knew he was outmatched. He could feel his strength fading, his body screaming in protest. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Evelyn reach the prototype. She grabbed it, her hands trembling, and turned to face the room. "This ends now," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Marcus froze, his eyes widening in realization. "No," he screamed, but it was too late. Evelyn pressed a button on the device, and a blinding light filled the room. Diesel felt a wave of heat, and then nothing. When Diesel opened his eyes, he was lying on the ground, his body aching and his ears ringing. The room was silent, the lights flickering weakly. He sat up slowly, his head spinning, and looked around. The guests were gone, the auction abandoned. Marcus was slumped against the wall, unconscious, but alive. And Evelyn. Evelyn was standing in the center of the room, the prototype in her hands. What happened?" Diesel asked, his voice hoarse. Evelyn turned to him, her face pale but resolute. "I destroyed it," she said simply. "The prototype. It's gone." He stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "But your company, your life's work, it was never about the company," she said, her voice soft. "It was about doing what was right. And sometimes that means letting go." Diesel didn't know what to say. He had spent so much of his life running from the past, trying to forget the person he used to be. But in that moment, he realized something. He wasn't just a man behind the wheel. He was someone who could make a difference, even in the smallest of ways. In the days that followed, the world moved on. The events at the warehouse were buried beneath headlines about corporate scandals and political intrigue. But for Diesel and Evelyn, life would never be the same. Evelyn stepped down as CEO of Carter Industries, choosing instead to focus on ethical technology development. She started a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that advancements in AI were used for the good of humanity, not for profit or power. As for Diesel, he went back to driving, but with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a future worth fighting for. The city was still alive, its streets still bustling with people rushing to their next destination. But for Diesel, it felt different. The chaos, the noise, the endless rhythm of life, it wasn't just something to endure. It was something to be a part of. As he drove through the streets, the sun setting behind the skyline, he thought about Evelyn's words. Sometimes, doing what's right means letting go. He had spent so much of his life holding on to the past, to the pain and the regrets. But now he was ready to let go. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Diesel felt like he was heading in the right direction. and that he realized was enough.